With the success of Resident Evil on the PlayStation, Capcom had built a strong tie with new contender Sony and bringing in many of their franchises to the console, including the sequel Resident Evil 2. But yet at the same time, Capcom still had their old ties with Nintendo, a company they had been working with since the NES days, and unlike Squaresoft, who moved on, Capcom wanted to maintain that friendship. As a result, a port of Resident Evil 1 was attempted on a 16MB Nintendo 64 cartridge, which at the time was their biggest cart available, and it simply couldn't be done due to the amount of voice acting, pre-rendered backgrounds, and FMV cutscenes needed to fit in. While size was the issue, an idea started to formulate for a Nintendo 64 exclusive Resident Evil game. Coming with this idea shortly after Resident Evil 2, the idea this time was to utilize the Nintendo 64's add-on, the 64 disk drive, with its 64MB of storage, giving a possibility of bringing the series over, which a system planner of the first game, Koji Oda, was being assigned as the director of this N64 exclusive, at the time with Noboru Sugimura and the company flagship set up by supervisor Yoshiki Okamoto were managing and writing the story of an expanded Resident Evil universe for all further entries. This Nintendo 64 Resident Evil game being one of them, and being penned as a prequel to the first two games that would take advantage of the quick loading of the Nintendo 64 as a means to control and switch between two characters on the fly. Through changing platforms, an entirely scrapped story, and a horde of cut concepts, today we shall explore the history and beta unused content of Resident Evil 0. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the subscribe button, hit the like button too, to further support us and keep creating new videos. Having just finished Resident Evil 2 in January 1998, work on scenarios for several games including Resident Evil 1.9/2.1, 3, and Code Veronica were being conducted. Sugimura and Flagship were as well writing up a Resident Evil for the Nintendo 64. Much as how Resident Evil 1 and 2 had a separate crew of characters, the game was to also feature their own exclusive duo who get caught up in the outbreak now reaching into the Arklay Mountains by Raccoon City. These being two punk-dressed civilians who get caught up in these affairs, a girl by the name of Annie, and a boy called Billy. Basically, much like Resident Evil 1.9/2.1 was going to be a side story, so was this. But soon ideas started to formulate on making a prequel to the whole series, exploring the origins of the virus and the main antagonistic corporation Umbrella. As a result, they decide to scrap the side story and make this instead. By August 1998, while this was in the works, supervisor Yoshiki Okamoto announced via Famitsu magazine that Resident Evil 64 was in the works, or so it was to be, except Capcom asked Famitsu magazine to censor the game's name as it was too early to announce, but the media was already suspecting that there was a good chance this was a Resident Evil game mentioned. But having now rebooted Resident Evil 64, the only aspect that was to be carried over was Billy, the name that is, as everything about him changed, now being an escaped prisoner, complete with a prison jumpsuit, handcuffs, and even the blonde hair from his original design. This was eventually revised 2 more times, giving him a more thuggish appearance, complete with a tattoo, along with long hair, just to be revised once more to have shorter hair that was slicked back. But as for Annie, she was to be replaced. An idea that Sugimura had was to explore the first game's mystery of how the STARS Bravo team was wiped out. As there was only one surviving member of Bravo team left, and rather prominent, the choice to replace Annie became clear. Enter Rebecca Chambers. As a character who appeared as the support to Chris Redfield in the first game, Rebecca had made her mark, and would fit well to tell that story of what happened to Bravo team. Her design for this game was going to have her lose her iconic red headband and wear shoulder pads and a beret, much akin to Jill Valentine's star uniform from the first game. An idea was that by the end of the game, she would get a red headband from Billy in order to transition better into the first game. But despite that, a design was made to depict her without her beret or shoulder pads too, possibly for an idea of maybe her losing these at some point in the game. Along with Rebecca, the other members of Bravo Team were made, including Edward Dewey, the first member of Bravo Team to die due to zombification, and last seen in Resident Evil 1 via his severed hand. Starting out with a purple vest originally, but soon given a blue one, as well as Enrico Marini, who was the other surviving member seen in Resident Evil 1 before being assassinated, appearing a lot like his Resident Evil 1 appearance, complete with a mustache, but instead had a white vest and was a lot buffer. This was soon changed to a black vest to better reflect the first game before being slimmed down. But seeing as this was a story to feature Umbrella's origins, series antagonist Albert Wesker was to also appear. Initially, a story was being made whereby Wesker, under the guise of stars, would go around in the game killing off each member of the Bravo team one at a time, utilizing a BOW creature he tamed to do the killing for him. But as it was pretty obvious to players of the first game that Wesker was a villain, this wouldn't make for such a good story. Therefore, the story was changed up to have Wesker more in the background, together with Resident Evil 2's Umbrella scientist, William Birkin, both working together to eventually betray Umbrella by the end. Instead, there was a new main antagonist by the name of James Marcus, who was a co-founder of Umbrella and responsible for creating a leech virus that would become one with him and even give him a younger variation of himself. By January 1999, Okamoto finally revealed via Dengeki magazine that Resident Evil for the Nintendo 64 was indeed in development. No censorship from Capcom this time. With the game scenario written, concepts were being designed for the game to start in a train that would feature the iconic zombies, along with train-themed ones at that too. While they were developing with the 64 disk drive in mind, by December 1999, it had become clear that it was a commercial failure. Seeing as how the 64 megabyte magnetic disc were not an option any further, they decided to switch to an equivalent idea, a 64 megabyte cartridge. This was already something that Capcom and the team at Angel Studios had used in doing the impossible port of Resident Evil 2 on the Nintendo 64, a new type of cartridge that was released, making the disk drive unnecessary. With that, the team switched to using the cartridge instead, but with access to a cartridge came the fast loading that was hindered with the disk drive's requirement to read magnetic discs. It as such would allow Resident Evil to finally load an area faster than ever, but bigger was that it gave the team an idea of a new form of the zapping system, the partner switching mechanic that was present in both Resident Evil 1 and 2. Initially, this was going to play like other Resident Evil games, with each character having their own scenario, but now, with the Nintendo 64 and cartridge's fast loading technology, an idea arose of both characters traveling together and being able to instantly switch between them. Let alone, it would even allow characters to drop weapons on the floor. In fact, the idea was going as far as to even allow for a co-op multiplayer where a second N64 controller could be plugged in so both Billy and Rebecca could be controlled independently. While building it, many experiments were conducted, including building smarter zombies who would both react on how they are shot and even run at the player. In fact, even including zombies outside a window, making the player think that they may break in, a means to go against normal series traditions. Designs were also being made for several BOW creatures that were scrapped at this stage too, including one called the Dolly, who would start as a cocoon on the ceiling before dropping down, removed since it would be difficult for the player to see the ceiling, followed by these infected spiders that would control humans, scrapped for being too far removed from the series. But a build was well on its way, and with Capcom preparing to show it off at the Spring Tokyo Game Show 2000. Here, a demo of the game was also present that let players go through the first section of the game on a train. At this stage, the game's dialogue was even already recorded, featuring characters including Edward Dewey, who was missing a hand here, as to stay canon with Resident Evil 1's opening of Alpha Team finding his hand. But bigger was letting players experience the zapping feature of quickly switching between Rebecca and Billy. While the cartridge format had proven its worth with quick loading, it still didn't stop certain slowdowns, such as when attacked by the Cerberus. But all in all, Resident Evil 0 had proven its mark at roughly 20% complete, which soon followed by May E3 2000, showcasing a new trailer of the game with a release date aiming for late 2000. Despite the hard work being put into building the game, an obvious truth was coming to light for the team. The game was too big for the Nintendo 64's cartridge. Despite Resident Evil 2 working on the Nintendo 64, the angelic hands of Angel Studios weren't there this time to cram it in. Simultaneously, the Nintendo GameCube had been announced, and Capcom, together with series creator Shinji Mikami, had already begun tinkering with it, specifically with a remake of Resident Evil 1 that would look and function leagues better than the late N64 release. At the same time, Capcom had begun reorganizing development teams, with Shinji Mikami's main Resident Evil team becoming Capcom Production Studio 4, and a team made specifically to concurrently develop Resident Evil 0, called Capcom Production Studio 3. And so, to solve the technical problems and wanting to stay apace with the remake being made by Studio 4, it was decided that Resident Evil 0 would hit the reset button and begin development again on the Nintendo GameCube. With an announcement in September 2001, only 5 months after the demo on the Nintendo 64, Capcom announced the move to the GameCube. Shinji Mikami, who also announced his Resident Evil 1 remake, announced that 0 would be complete within a year after releasing the remake, aiming for a late 2002 release. This would give ample time for the team to remake the game and actually complete it, remaking all the pre-rendered backgrounds from the Nintendo 64 in this much more atmospheric, higher quality render, featuring dynamic lighting thanks to the power of the GameCube. Progress was slow as a result, as they had to start from scratch, so slow that by April 2001, when Capcom had a seminar, they only could show the game's logo. But despite that, real progress was being made in rebuilding the game and staying rather faithful to the Nintendo 64 version's design, so much so that Rebecca was keeping her exact design from that period, complete with her beret and shoulder pads. On the flip side, Resident Evil 1's remake, which was in concurrent development, was also remaking Rebecca within that game too. Difference now was that she was to have a completely new design, lacking her headband from the original game and not having that beret and shoulder pads from the Zero project. And so, in order to remain consistent, Zero's Rebecca was changed to reflect that new design, and in fact the remake team even borrowed her new model from the Zero team in order to use in that game, as they completed it first. But other changes were being made too, to stay more consistent with Mikami's vision of the remake. Another was Edward Dewey, who the team had losing his hand in the Nintendo 64 version, but seeing as the scene where his hand was found in the original was not to appear in the remake, the Zero team let Dewey keep his hand. In fact, writer Noboru Sugimura was called in to do some rewrites of sections of the game, which Sugimura had forgotten what he had even written, as this was done several years ago at this point. Some of the major rewrites involved Billy Cohen, who, unlike the Nintendo 64 version, had him be a random escaped prisoner that Rebecca doesn't recognize. He was now a prisoner that Star's Bravo team was transporting for execution. Let alone, a major change was conducted, where the game was to have endings where either Billy or Rebecca could die, much as in Resident Evil 1, with certain characters dying depending on your decisions. A rewrite that was necessary, as Rebecca dying would ruin the Resident Evil canon, considering she was set to appear a few days later in that very mansion. And thanks to the GameCube's increased storage, more FMV cutscenes were being made and new higher quality lines recorded, ones much more in line with Sugimura's rewrites at that. Soon enough, Nintendo's Space Road 2000 event was coming up in August, and Capcom still didn't have enough to show off, leading to the press to speculate that it was quietly cancelled, something Capcom quickly put the kibosh on, with them confirming the development is progressing. One hurdle the team had now was that they were back on discs, meaning that load times were once again an issue, which could impede on the game's zapping system. For this, the team had to get creative, as Rebecca and Billy could very well be in different rooms and would require a long wait time. For this, the GameCube's RAM was the solution, whereby it would keep data of the room the characters were in locked away in the GameCube's 24 megabytes of RAM. Therefore, when needing to switch, it would quickly load the already loaded room waiting within the RAM, escaping the disk loading issue. But still carrying on other N64 elements, the idea of dropping items anywhere was also to be carried over, but at the cost of the item box. This was the team's idea of trying to make this a harder entry, and a callback to the inspiration of the series Sweet Home. Meanwhile, other aspects weren't being kept, such as the 2 zombies that were outside the train that may or may not have wanted to bust in. Bigger was the removal of the co-op multiplayer. While no reason was given on whether it was a creative or technical issue, it's possible it could have been difficult with fixed cameras in place. On the flip side, some scrapped enemies were being redesigned for the GameCube version. This includes Wesker's monster, which was now remade into the Eliminators, and the dolly became the Plague Crawlers. The game was getting close to completion, and so with confidence behind Capcom, out of nowhere, Capcom's website suddenly updated on April 2002, with the first bit of news on the GameCube version, with the zapping feature being reconfirmed. It was now also confirmed that it would appear at the May E3 2002 event, and so rolled around E3, where Nintendo showed the game's first true trailer in 2 years, showing the train segment of the game in this haunting new render. Soon enough, Capcom announced that the game's demo would come out in Japan on August 2002, called the Trial Edition, covering much as it did in the Nintendo 64 build, the train segment of the game. While mostly consistent with the final game, it did contain several pieces that were cut altogether already, but left in the game's data, including this hallway that was to be attached to the church but was replaced by a balcony in the final game. This along with several unused items, many of which were key items to be used with puzzles, or simply earlier designs of final ones. Several were also weapon upgrades, such as for the handgun, including receiving a silencer, the magnum, and the shotgun, as well as weapons that were cut altogether, including a hand grenade, which would be a first for the series, and even the rocket launcher in order to stay with series tradition for the final boss, something that was changed for the first time. And soon Resident Evil 0 released on November 12, 2002 in Japan, followed by the 21st in North America, receiving high acclaim from critics for its high level of detail and atmosphere, which together with animated effects, such as flickering lights, really brought it to life. This being combined with the sound design, which made excellent use of footsteps, general environmental sounds, and even silence at the right moments. But while it looked and sounded great, the greatest criticism did come to its gameplay, a big attribute being how it stuck to the classic tank controls of the series, and not evolving it as many games had like Devil May Cry and even new contender Eternal Darkness. Another criticism was for the loss of the item box, a great way for the players to transfer their items throughout the game, but now with the ability to drop items anywhere, there wasn't a need for an item box throughout the game, and instead required one to backtrack to wherever they dropped these items. Even so, reviewers such as Mark McDonald of OneUp.com and Matt Casamessina of IGN felt it did enough, as they still felt it eliminated enough backtracking to need to go to an item box. The zapping system, which was a big selling point of the game, did receive praise for adding a new dimension to the series, such as requiring both characters to complete a puzzle together, but ultimately, most found the AI of the partner to be lacking, to the point of where one would have to babysit them. But despite these, the game was loved, and went on to sell 1.25 million copies on the GameCube, holding up well to the numbers the series had been pulling in yet. Over time, the game did receive many re-releases, most notably a high-definition remaster that upres these phenomenal pre-rendered backgrounds that still to date look amazing, together with providing new textures to characters and items, let alone even remaking models, as well as adding the new mode called Wesker mode, where Wesker replaces Billy and uses many special strong abilities to his advantage, going on to outsell the original at 2.8 million units as of December 2020. But as this was the first game to use the zapping feature of quickly switching between characters, this also became the first game to have two characters who would venture out together in this horror setting, whereby with the coming of a fifth entry down the road, that game was set to take this feature and evolve it into a whole multiplayer experience. And thank you for watching. Please hit the subscribe button for more Resident Evil and other games gaming history and cut content soon. Hit the like button and comment below on if you enjoyed Resident Evil 0 or not. So everyone, thank you for watching.